She vanished just hours before the vows, her white dress untouched on the hanger, cake waiting in the reception hall, and her fiancé pacing by the altar as whispers of cold feet began to poison the air. 25 years later, a letter arrived with no return address, stained with age and silence. Inside, only 16 words, handwritten in trembling ink. I never meant to leave, but I had no choice. Forgive me, L. Time cracked wide open. What had been buried in memory and grief now clawed its way back, raw and unanswered. The groom, now a man marked by decades of absence, held the letter like an echo from the grave. But who was L? And what choice had stolen her away on the happiest, most cursed day of his life? The truth had been buried for a quarter of a century, but now, someone wanted it exhumed. In the weeks that followed, the letter became both a beacon and a curse. Michael Langston, once a hopeful groom, now a weathered man of 52, found himself haunted by memories long locked away. He had tried to build a life after Lauren disappeared, tried to forget her freckled smile, the way she nervously twisted her grandmother's locket when she was nervous, the warmth in her voice when she whispered, "Forever means no escape." But the letter shattered the fragile peace he'd wrapped around his brokenness. He placed it beneath glass on his desk, reading it each morning as if repetition might will it into clarity. Nothing was stolen from the house. There had been no ransom, no evidence. Just a vanished bride, a family shattered, and the town of Marrow Creek left choking on rumors. And now, a voice from the past had returned, just 16 words unlocking questions soaked in sorrow. Who would send it now, after all this time? And why? Marrow Creek was a town built on buried things, coal, secrets, and the knowledge that some ghosts never left. In 1999, when Lauren Whitaker vanished, it was as though the earth itself swallowed her. The sheriff's department launched a full-scale search, combing through dense woodland, abandoned mining tunnels, and the icy riverbanks where the town whispered tragedies slept. Helicopters scanned the valley, sniffer dogs traced her scent to the edge of the pine forest, and then, nothing. Her trail vanished like breath in winter air. The last confirmed sighting? A blurry gas station security image showing her face, pale and uncertain beneath flickering fluorescent light, just 2 hours before she was meant to walk down the aisle. The wedding was called off, but not publicly. Guests waited in the candlelit chapel as Michael's best man lied through tight teeth about a family emergency, but whispers grew like mold in heavy rain. Some said she ran. Others swore they saw a black SUV idling near the church that morning. The most cruel theory of all? That Michael had something to hide. Either way, no one ever saw her again. Until now. The arrival of the letter fractured something deeper than memory. It cracked the timeline itself. Suddenly, the grief Michael had mourned for 25 years became suspicion, and every word Lauren had ever said took on a new shape. His hands trembled as he revisited the church for the first time in decades. The stained glass was faded, its colors dulled by sun and silence, but the air still carried the weight of that missing hour. Beside the altar, he could still see the flowers wilting in their vases, untouched bridesmaids' bouquets abandoned like ghost offerings. He stared at the aisle where she'd never walked, whispering her name under breath like an incantation. Was she here that day? Did she see him waiting? Or had something darker intervened, something that watched from the shadows while Marrow Creek wrapped itself in polite denial? A new question bloomed, heavy and unrelenting. Had everyone been looking in the wrong place all along? That week, Michael drove out to the edge of town, a place where the highway bleeds into forest and fog, where teenagers dare each other to trespass into the old Whitaker farm. Now just a collapsed roof and rusted fence hidden behind encroaching pines. It hadn't been Lauren's home in decades, but it still held the shape of her childhood. Michael stood in the overgrown yard, wind nudging tall grass like whispers brushing memory. He remembered the afternoons they'd spent there, sitting on the swinging porch bench, her head on his shoulder as cicadas screamed the summer alive. Now, silence. The front steps had rotted through, and the windows were black eyes staring back. But then, a glint, barely visible beneath the porch's edge, something round, metallic, catching the light. He knelt, heart lurching, and reached blindly into the dirt. When he pulled it free, soil falling away like time itself, he saw it, Lauren's grandmother's locket, the same one she never took off. The same one she wore the day she vanished. Someone had been here, and they wanted to be found. He stared at the locket in his palm, its delicate gold chain tangled in roots and time. The tiny oval was scratched, but when he pressed the hidden clasp, it sprang open with a reluctant click. Inside, two faded photos, one of Lauren as a child, grinning in a sunflower field, the other of her mother, a woman whose stern eyes always seemed to scan for threats only she could see. But there was something else, slipped behind the photos, a folded paper fragment mottled with mold. Carefully, painstakingly, Michael unfolded it. A map. Roughly drawn, torn from a notebook, with a red X marked deep inside what locals called Widow's Hollow, a place children were warned never to enter, a place where the land felt older than the town itself. Why would Lauren, or someone else, hide this here? Was it a trail, a warning, or a long-forgotten plan? The locket was no longer jewelry, it was bait, and someone wanted Michael to follow. Widow's Hollow was not on any official map, but anyone who grew up in Marrow Creek knew exactly where it lay. A sunken gash in the land, tangled in thorns and hush, where even birds refused to sing. Legends wrapped it in folklore, of witches, of disappearances, of voices heard at dusk whispering names long gone, but Michael was not a man who feared stories anymore. He packed a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and the old leather journal he'd kept since Lauren vanished. At dawn, mist coiling low like breath from a sleeping beast, he crossed into the hollow. The trail was barely a suggestion, lost beneath collapsed branches and the sickly scent of rot. Hours passed, the forest growing thicker, darker, lonelier. Then, there it was. A clearing, marked by moss-blistered stones and a single tree scorched by lightning long ago. Beneath that tree, just where the red X had promised, something unnatural jutted from the ground, the edge of a metal hatch, rusted shut and waiting. It wasn't part of any building, it didn't belong, and it absolutely wasn't supposed to be here. Michael's breath caught. His past, his grief, his guilt, his unanswered prayers, had led him to this exact moment. He gripped the latch. It groaned under his hand like a beast disturbed. Somewhere beneath his feet, secrets no longer wanted to stay buried. The metal hatch splintered the silence as it opened, its hinges shrieking like something alive. A gust of cold, stale air escaped into the forest, a breath long held. Michael's flashlight cut through the black, casting narrow circles of trembling light on concrete walls, slick with damp and years. A ladder led down, 20 feet at least, into a bunker hewn from stone and reinforced metal. He descended slowly, each step reverberating with dread. Below, the space yawned into a small chamber, bare, save for a cot, a rusted table, and a stack of weathered notebooks tied with twine. On the wall, a calendar, 1999, with every day until June 12th marked with red X's. The day she vanished bore no mark. Michael's heart slammed. Whoever had been here had kept time by it. He reached for the notebooks, hand shaking, but before he could untie them, he heard it, a sharp, metallic clink deeper in the dark. Not the echo of his own movement. Something else. Something breathing. Watching. Waiting. Michael froze. Each breath felt like it echoed off the walls, magnifying his presence in the darkness. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, its beam trembling, bare shelves, broken crates, nothing. Then again, that metallic clink, closer now, urgent, deliberate. He backed toward the ladder, but his hand brushed something on the table. The notebooks. They were the reason he'd come this far, and he couldn't leave without them. He grabbed the bundle, tugged at the twine, and the topmost notebook fell open. The handwriting inside was unmistakable, graceful, looping script he'd memorized in love letters and dreams. It was Lauren's. The first line sent a chill pouring down his spine. If someone finds this, I am not dead, but I am not free. And then, beneath it, a name he hadn't heard in decades. Not Lauren's, but someone tied to her past, someone long buried in sleepy police reports and whispered warnings. Secrets had lived down here for 25 years, and now, they were waking. The name written beneath Lauren's desperate words sent lightning through Michael's bones. Evelyn Whitaker. Her aunt. The family recluse. The woman who vanished from Marrow Creek 5 years before Lauren did. Officially, she'd been declared dead in absentia. Unofficially, she'd been forgotten, erased from memory like a stain too stubborn to scrub out completely. The town called her unwell, troubled, maybe even dangerous. Family gatherings stopped when Evelyn appeared. And then, she stopped appearing at all. Michael rifled through the remaining pages, fingers trembling. Each notebook was a diary of captivity, a chronicle of shadows and codes, of survival stitched together through terror and hope. Lauren had not simply disappeared. She had been taken, hidden. And Evelyn, it seemed, hadn't gone missing after all. She had been underground, orchestrating something brutal, or perhaps protecting something darker than anyone had dared to imagine. But why? And why now, so many years later? Was Michael the one being led back to it all? A pattern was emerging, scrawled in ink and silence, but the answer was waiting just beyond the reach of light. Michael emerged from the bunker as the sky bruised into dusk, the cold notebooks pressed to his chest like scripture. Every step back through Widow's Hollow felt heavier, as though the trees themselves resisted his return. His mind spiraled, Lauren writing from captivity, Evelyn's name woven into each desperate entry, the sense that time had folded in on itself to hide a deeper truth. That night, back at his dining table, he laid out the diaries under lamplight, scanning pages inked with isolation and dread. One passage stood out, underlined 3 times in startling red. She said they'd never believe us, that the town would rather bury screams than speak them. Michael's eyes narrowed. Who was she? Evelyn? Or someone even closer? Another flash. Lauren's words, years ago. Forever means no escape. It hadn't been romantic. It had been a warning, a coded cry. If Evelyn hadn't taken Lauren alone, then who else had helped her vanish from that chapel? Marrow Creek, with its smiles like fences and secrets like stones, had the town been complicit all along? The answer, Michael suspected, lay not in the forest or the bunker, but in the eyes of those who'd watched him suffer for a quarter-century with polite silence. The morning after uncovering Lauren's notebooks, he drove into town, not to the sheriff, but to the one person who had always seemed to know more than she ever said, Clara Bell, the former church custodian and self-appointed keeper of Marrow Creek's unspoken truths. Time had curled her like dried parchment, but her memory was sharp as frost. As he sat across from her in her cluttered living room, he showed her the locket, the map, and the first notebook. Her expression didn't change, but a long-held breath slipped through her lips. "That girl never ran," Clara said finally, voice barely a whisper. "They made her disappear. Evelyn was just the hands. The church, the town, the ones in suits who came that night, long after the guests left. I saw them through the sacristy window. No one believed me then. But you have the proof now." Michael's heart pounded. The rabbit hole wasn't just dug by family, it had been widened by authority, power, and fear. Marrow Creek hadn't just lost a bride. It had buried her alive in its own guilt. And as secrets bled into light, one truth burned brighter than the rest. Some ceremonies are only the beginning of the curse. Michael left Clara's house with more than answers. He left with a purpose sharpened by outrage. The image of the men in suits, faceless and looming in the shadows of his wedding day, struck him with sickening clarity. Buried within Marrow Creek's picturesque facade was a rot older than Evelyn Whitaker's madness or Lauren's disappearance, a collusion of silence, of reputations guarded like relics, of truth suffocated beneath ceremony and holy walls. The notebooks hinted at more than abduction. They suggested experiments, secrecy, money changing hands. Lauren had uncovered something, or perhaps she was born into it. One final journal entry pulsed beneath the lamp's dim light, one he had missed until then, dated June 13, 1999. Just hours after she vanished. "They took me because of what I saw. Evelyn tried to warn me. But it's deeper than family. It's the foundation. If I disappear, know this: follow the bells." Michael looked up, mind racing. The church bells of Marrow Creek had rung every Sunday for 100 years, except on that single afternoon a quarter-century ago. June 12th. The day they didn't ring. The day she vanished. He stood, fists clenched. The town had performed its rituals for decades, but one bell, one truth, had been silenced. Now, he would make it ring again. The next morning, Michael stood before the aging church, its steeple rising through mist like a ghost's finger pointing to heaven's silence. The door groaned open with reluctant memory. Inside, dust floated in shafts of muted light, and the air smelled of aged wood, candle wax, and unspoken things. He didn't come to pray. He came to listen, to the walls, to the bells, to the silence that had hidden screams. He climbed the tower's narrow stairs, each footstep echoing like a heartbeat trapped in stone. At the top, the bell mechanism loomed, ancient, rusted, frozen in time. He brushed away cobwebs. That's when he saw it. Etched in metal beneath a flaking panel, barely visible unless you knew where to look. 3 initials, carved with trembling precision. LWH. Lauren Whitaker Holloway. Her real name. Her whole name. A name she never used outside of legal documents, kept secret even from Michael. He stepped back. His breath caught. Holloway. The name of the company that once funded the church's reconstruction. The company that vanished from the records after 1999. The company run by a board of faceless names with ties to Chicago, Washington, and silence. The company that had wanted her gone. It hadn't been just about love, or fear, or madness. It had been about bloodlines, power, knowledge hidden in scripture and stained glass. And now, Michael realized, he was not the only one climbing those steps. Truth was finally rising with him, step by step, refusing to stay buried another minute. At the summit, amid spiderwebs and the heavy thud of decades gone silent, Michael reached for the cracked bell rope. His hand hesitated, dangling midair like a verdict still undecided. He imagined her, Lauren, 25 years ago, eyes wide with terror, or resistance, being led down the very steps he'd just climbed, hidden away not just by a family secret, but by an entire architecture of deceit. Holloway hadn't just disappeared from records, it had been erased like sin scrubbed from a confessional booth. But Lauren had stitched fragments of truth in quiet places, in maps tucked into lockets, in words etched beside sacred bells, in notebooks untouched by sunlight for decades. Michael gripped the rope and pulled. The bell screamed to life, its sound jagged and defiant, breaking through the town like a blade through veneer. Windows shivered across Marrow Creek, curtains twitched. And those who remembered June 12th now felt it like thunder at the door. The first honest sound in a quarter-century rang out, not as a call to worship, but a reckoning. In that tolling resonance, Lauren's message echoed loudest. History never forgets, it waits, and once awakened, it demands to be answered. It didn't take long. By the next day, the bell's toll had begun to ripple through Marrow Creek in ways no one could contain. Elderly townsfolk fidgeted with long-ignored memories. Former Holloway employees who had long since fled the town received anonymous packages containing photocopied journal entries. The local newspaper, once silent under corporate pressure, published a front-page exposé, "The Bride Who Rang the Bell, a Town's 25-year silence ends." And then, another letter arrived. Same envelope, same trembling hand. This time with a photo. Blurred, aged, but unmistakable. Lauren, older, weary, but alive, standing in front of the scorched tree in Widow's Hollow, dated just 3 months ago. Beneath it, a single line. "You heard me. Now find me." Hope cracked through Michael like sunlight through broken pews. The mystery had never been about a vanished bride. It had been about a silenced witness. And now, the final thread had been pulled. Somewhere, in the tangled roots of past and present, Lauren waited, not just to be found, but to be freed. Michael traced the blurred photograph with trembling fingers, unable to look away from the woman at its center, worn by time, yes, but undeniably Lauren. Her eyes still bore the fire of defiance, even through faded pigment and pixelation. Standing before the scorched tree, as if guarding the portal to her buried truth, she seemed less ghost, more sentinel. Somewhere out there, she was alive. And she was waiting. A flood of grief, fury, and longing surged through him. 25 years of silence, cracked open in a single echo of a bell. But now, the search was no longer for answers, it was for Lauren herself. Michael packed the notebooks, the photo, and one last thing, her locket, now polished and glinting in the morning light. The road back to Widow's Hollow unfurled before him, not just as a path through trees, but a descent into the marrow of everything Marrow Creek had tried to forget. He didn't know what waited beyond that scorched tree. But Michael Langston, once a groom without a bride, now carried the clarity of a man who'd heard the voice of truth break silence. And he would follow it into fire if he had to. Because love, like truth, does not die, it waits, and today, it beckoned. Michael reached Widow's Hollow just as the sun slipped behind the ridgeline, casting the trees in blue and ash. The scorched tree loomed before him, unchanged, save for the small wooden marker placed at its base, new, carved with initials he instantly recognized, LWH. The locket in his pocket pulsed like a heartbeat against his thigh. He stepped forward, heart clanging louder than the bell had. The earth beneath the tree had been disturbed, faint lines where something had been unearthed or buried. He knelt, running fingers over the wood, when a sound broke the air behind him, a voice, hoarse and uncertain. "Michael." He stood, blood roaring in his ears. There she was. Lauren. Time had weathered her, silence had aged her, but her eyes were the same. They didn't embrace, they simply looked. Two people staring across a chasm of years, pain and betrayal. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried to stay gone, to protect you, but they never really stopped watching." Michael stepped closer. Speech failed. All that remained was her hand reaching for his. The hollow behind them, the town beyond them, the truth beneath them, all unspeakable. But beside this scorched tree, where darkness once ruled and secrets once lived, stood two hearts breaking their own silence. And as dusk settled, it was not the bell, but their reunion, that rang truest of all. Their hands met between the years like the closing of a wound, with quiet ache, with trembling peace. Neither spoke for a long time. Words, after all, had built the lattice of lies that imprisoned them both. Beneath the failing light, Lauren led Michael toward a narrow path veiled by shadows, a path deeper into the hollow, where the world sharpened with silence. She showed him the place where she had lived in fractured fragments, a cabin half swallowed by ivy, a world sustained by wire radio, root cellars, and solitude. "They let me think I was protecting you," she said later that night, eyes glistening as they sat beneath a dome of soft stars. "But it was always about them. About what I knew, and what I refused to become." The night held them in suspended time, no longer bride and groom, but two survivors suspended over the wreckage of a town's denial. And though the moon dipped low and the wind whispered in the trees, the silence between them no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to beginning. Because 25 years ago, the bells didn't ring. But now, truth had returned in flesh and sound, and it would never be silenced again. In the weeks that followed, the whispers in Marrow Creek grew louder than any bell. Investigators reopened files long declared dormant. Tips poured in from neighboring towns, names resurfaced from redacted documents, and once planted denials were yanked out like invasive roots. Michael and Lauren met with federal agents in unmarked cars, recounting every shadowed corridor, every coded page, every face that flickered in memory between nightmare and fact. Not everyone welcomed their return. Windows smashed. Anonymous calls hissed warnings, but they no longer bowed to silence. Together, they stood in courtrooms and press conferences, revealing not just a disappearance, but a conspiracy stretching decades and sinking talons into church, corporation, and country. Evelyn's role remained both monstrous and tragic, coerced guardian or misguided villain, her name now etched in the dual tones of lament and reckoning. Still, through trials and testimonies, Lauren kept the locket with her, its quiet weight reminding her of everything stolen and reclaimed. And when, 1 year later, the bells of Marrow Creek rang freely once more, this time to celebrate her and Michael's rejoining, not in ceremony, but in honest, unvarnished love, the town held its breath. Because some stories end at the altar, but others begin at the ruins. And in the soft echo of those long-denied chimes, the truth walked freely, at last. Years passed, but the aftermath of the truths unearthed in Marrow Creek continued to ripple outward like rings on black water. The church was dismantled, brick by stained brick, its sacred walls no longer able to hold the weight of their complicity. The Holloway name disappeared from foundations and scholarships, replaced by acknowledgments to survivors. And Lauren? She never returned to the life she'd once known, because that life had never truly belonged to her. She and Michael relocated to a quiet coastal town, where the wind didn't carry echoes, only waves. She taught poetry to students who didn't ask about scars, and he found peace in tending a garden that bloomed wild, uncontained. They never rebuilt a wedding. They built something slower, truer. A life without performance. Yet every June 12th, without fail, they rang a single bell, from a church long silenced, in a town that had finally learned to listen, not for ceremony, for remembrance, for warning, for love. And so, Marrow Creek became something new, not a town defined by its hush, but by the voices that rose from its silence. Where once truths were buried in hollow ground and sacred halls, now they stood etched in stone and testimony. Michael and Lauren, no longer fugitives of memory, became keepers of a story that warned against the seduction of forgetting. They visited the scorched tree each summer, laying a single sunflower at its base, a symbol of what had once tried to wither, but bloomed against the odds. The scar of those missing years would always remain, tender and real, but so too would the beating core of something unbroken: devotion, courage, and the quiet rebellion of telling the truth. In the end, the bride had not vanished. She had endured. And the groom had not waited in vain. They were no longer bound by ceremony, but by fire and faith and memory made honest. The bell had been silenced, but they had made it sing again. Sometimes, people came to Marrow Creek seeking explanations: journalists, historians, even curious strangers who'd heard the echoes of a tale too strange to ignore. They asked about the bunker, the church, the bell, but more often than not, they left not with facts, but with a feeling of ache, of awe, of something holy in its haunting. Michael and Lauren no longer offered full answers. They told their story once, and then let it breathe. The rest, they believed, belonged to those willing to listen for it, not in the noise, but in the stillness that follows. The scorched tree still stood, weathered and stubborn, its twisted bark dark as old secrets. And just beyond it, carved into the earth in soft, deliberate lines, were 5 words left by Lauren in her final journal, now kept in the local archive. Some truths do not die. They endure, through silence, through scars, through the defiant ringing of a single, patient bell. And in that endurance lay the legacy of a love story rewritten, not in romance, but in resistance. Not in the fairy tale once promised, but in the fierce truth reclaimed across time and ruin. Marrow Creek stood quieter these days, but not silent. The bell in the repurposed town square rang each year on June 12th, signaling not an arrival or a union, but a vow to never forget. Schoolchildren learned the tale not as folklore, but as fact, of a bride who vanished and a groom who followed the echoes until they became a chorus. There were no statues, no plaques, just the sound of that faithful chime and the wind passing through trees that once bore witness. Some scars remain unseen yet unforgettable. And some stories, like the one Michael and Lauren shared, do not end with a kiss or curtain close. They go on, quietly, stubbornly. In every moment a truth dares to ring out, despite the hush it must rise through to be heard. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Marrow Creek wasn't what had happened in its past, but how close it came to convincing itself that nothing ever had. The silence wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was meticulously crafted, an artifact of fear passed down like heirloom guilt. Yet now, each June 12th, when the bell tolled once more, it carried with it the vibration of voices once lost and truths unspoken. It echoed through homes and hills, not as an alarm, but as a promise, that even when love is buried beneath tradition, power, and time, it can still dig its way back into the light. In their quiet home by the shore, Michael would often find Lauren standing by the window at dusk, fingers resting on the locket's curve. And though the world outside moved on, within that slant of light, in her quiet breath, and in the unwavering toll of remembrance, they both knew, some loves are forged not in vows, but in battle. And some stories never truly end, because they were never meant to be forgotten. Lauren's final words on the story would live not in books or screens, but in the gentle candor of her presence. "The world tried to make me silent," she told a journalist once, years after the trials and inquiries had waned. "But silence isn't safety, it's surrender." That quote, etched into a bench beside the scorched tree, became something of a pilgrimage point, not for spectacle, but for solace. Survivors of different silences would visit, leaving tokens beneath her words: folded letters, worn photographs, single sunflowers. Though Michael and Lauren remained private, they understood the power of bearing witness, of allowing one truth to light 1,000 more. And as each June passed and the bell rang across Marrow Creek, clear, defiant, steady, the town no longer recoiled from its echo. It listened, learned, and remembered. Because in the end, the bride had never truly vanished. Her voice had simply waited for someone to follow it, through silence, shadow, and time, back into the light. In the soft hum of a town finally exhaled, Lauren and Michael walked the woodland path one last time, not as fugitives or echoes, but as keepers of a truth too sacred to be forgotten. The scorched tree, now wrapped in ivy and light, stood vigil still, its bark softer now, its curse transformed into testament. A small crowd gathered that year, locals, survivors, young voices just learning the weight of history. As the final bell rang, clear as glass and heavy as love, Lauren stood with her hand over her heart, the locket pressing warm against her skin. The sound carried not just through the town, but through memory, through time, through every silence that had once dared to seal her away. In that moment, Marrow Creek was not a place of shame, but of awakening. And as Lauren turned from the tree toward Michael, sunlight fanning behind her like absolution, it was clear. The past had been faced, the present reclaimed, and the future, at last, was hers to write, out loud. Long after the headlines faded, and the hush of justice gave way to everyday breath, Marrow Creek settled into a new kind of stillness, one not born of secrecy, but of reverence. The town's children now played near the repurposed bell tower, unaware of how close they came to growing up in a place built on forgetting. The chapel ruins became a garden. The bunker entrance, sealed and marked, a monument not to horror, but to endurance. And at the edge of Widow's Hollow, where earth once held silence like a secret, you could now find a bench beneath the tree, sun-dappled and soft, where two names, Michael Langston and Lauren Whitaker Holloway, were etched in brass, not as a fairy tale, not as victims, but as the ones who rethreaded silence into sound, grief into truth, love into something enduring. And as the bell rang once more, for the 26th time on the 12th of June, it told a story that no longer needed to be spoken, only heard. Years later, when the story of Marrow Creek found its way into school curriculums and memorial documentaries, the narrative always ended not with justice served or villains named, but with the image of a bell tolling against a bruised sky, its echo not clean, but full of ghosts that had finally found voice. Visitors still walked the wooded trails, unsure of what they hoped to find, only knowing that something in the air felt heavier, sacred. And there, beneath the tree that had once watched over betrayal, love, and defiance, the brass plaque remained polished by rain and reverence. Some knelt, some wept. But all listened, because even in silence, the truth had found a way to ring. And when all the pages yellowed and the first witnesses of the past grew silver-haired or silent, the truth still lingered, in the breath between chimes, in the hush before summer's dusk. Marrow Creek aged, but did not forget. Children grew up under fresher skies, but were taught to name the darkness that preceded their dawn. The story of Lauren and Michael was no longer myth, no longer mystery. It was a living vow whispered down generations, that silence is not peace, and love is worth the toll. And so each June 12th, as the bell unfurled its single solemn note, it was not just for the bride who vanished, or the groom who waited, but for all who had ever been lost and found by the sheer, defiant act of being heard. Because in a world eager to bury what it fears, the most dangerous thing you can do is ring the bell anyway. So the bell tolled, not just for one lost soul, but for all the voices once caged in doubt and shadow. In homes and gatherings, in empty spaces once filled with silence, its echo carved a promise: never again. Marrow Creek became a place where history did not hide its pain, but displayed it, a caution and a compass. And Lauren, whose absence had once been whispered with dread, was now spoken of with reverence. She and Michael remained part of the land, not as saints, not as myths, but as reminders that truth, buried long enough, grows roots and rises. The bride who vanished had become the witness who returned. The groom who waited became the man who listened. And the bell was no longer brass and rope. It was legacy. It was defiance. It was love. And every time it rang, it said what so many had once been afraid to believe, that in the end, no silence holds forever. The truth always finds its voice. Now, even as decades layered gently over the soul of Marrow Creek like fallen leaves on old earth, that single bell remained, weathered, patient, resolute. Tourists came and went, documentaries aired and faded, officials changed, but the tone of that chime, clear, mournful, unyielding, never lost its timbre. For those who once hid behind curtains or rumors, its ringing was a reckoning. For the broken and silenced, it was a hymn. And for Lauren and Michael, now quietly tending a life stitched, slowly back together, it was a song of what survived. The bell rang not to recall suffering alone, but to mark the triumph of revelation, of voices once trembling now immortal. Beneath ivy and stone, beneath stories and scars, it rang. Through storm, through sun, through time. And perhaps that is the truest ending of all. Not silence restored, but truth reborn. In sound, in love, in echoes carried far beyond Marrow Creek's borders. Until the world, too, remembers how to listen. And still, the bell waits, for storms to pass, for blossoms to return, for footsteps on the hollow trail. It does not ring idly, only when the world is ready to hear. And in that measured silence, Marrow Creek thrives in its truth. The scars of its past have become the veins of its new heart, pulsing not with fear, but with memory honored. Lauren and Michael remain mostly unseen now, walking the town like quiet constellations, guiding, never overtaking. The bench beneath the scorched tree is kept clean, the plaque burnished each spring by unseen hands. And when each June 12th comes again, as surely as breath follows night, it tolls once more, not out of grief, not out of rage, but out of fierce, enduring love, a love that outlived secrecy. That stood against silence, that dared to rise. The bell rings, and the sound is no longer of an ending, but of resilience shaped into history, echoing into forever. And so, as twilight drapes itself over the trees of Marrow Creek each June 12th, the bell tolls once more, not as a relic of the past, but as a living echo of defiance and devotion. The town no longer strains to forget, nor fears to remember. It listens, and in that listening, history breathes, not through monuments, but through the simple weight of memory shared. Lauren and Michael, no longer the center of the story but its vigilant caretakers, sit quietly on the porch of their coastal home, where the sea hushes but does not hide. In their silence is a knowing, of pain endured, of truth reclaimed, of a love that followed echoes into the dark and came back ringing. The bell of Marrow Creek waits for no permission. It rings because it must. Because once, a bride disappeared and her voice was buried. Now, her voice is the chime itself, clear, steady, unwavering. And every time it sings, it tells us all, silence may linger, but truth endures, always. So when the bell rings again, as it always will, let it not speak only of the past, but of every voice that now dares to rise where silence once ruled. Let it ring for the ones still searching. Let it ring for secrets gasping to be freed. Let it ring for the young who must learn that history does not stay buried unless we let it. In that ringing, hear Lauren's voice, not trembling, not hidden, but standing tall in the open air. Hear Michael's steadfast hope, no longer waiting, but walking beside her. And hear, most of all, a town that once chose silence, now choosing sound. Marrow Creek, no longer a name shaded by loss, but lit by remembrance. Its bell does not toll to mourn what was taken. It tolls to honor what endured, and as long as it stands, so too will the vow it keeps repeating. The truth is not afraid of time, it only waits, to be heard, believed, and finally, set free. And so, let the final toll of the bell be not a farewell, but a covenant, a whispered promise from generations past to those yet to walk the paths of Widow's Hollow or breathe the hush of Marrow Creek's reshaped hills. Let that sound carry more than history. It carries resilience etched into earth and air, the marrow-deep truth that cannot be uprooted. Somewhere, in every chime, Lauren's courage lives on, and Michael's unwavering belief that love is not just tenderness, but tenacity. They are the keepers of that sound now, quieter with age, but never quieter in conviction. The story they lived, survived, uncovered, and shared no longer belongs to secrecy. It belongs to every ear that listens, every truth that pushes through soil and shadow, reaching toward the light. And as Marrow Creek sleeps each night beneath stars and stories, the bell waits, not for silence to return, but for the next soul brave enough to let the truth ring again.